Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and each week I meet with military veterans to learn about their civilian career, what they do, how they got there, and advice for other veterans transitioning in their career. Today is episode number 186 with Donnie Benjamin.
This isn't my first job. This is my third job after business school, and it's not like I just found a job that motivates me like this. This is the first one, and I had to try things out. I had to be okay moving away from things and jobs that were just okay, or I could have been fine, could have been comfortable, but I didn't wake up excited to do it. So I really want people to know this was a struggle for me to find something like this, and I even got a little concerned after a while. Well, maybe I just don't love working anywhere. Maybe it's just something that I'm just not built to do. And I think fortunately this opportunity came up.
I just got off the interview with Donnie, and I'm so energized and fired up. I'm already reaching out to him right after this to schedule another chat with him to do a deeper dive on blockchain, Ethereum, Bitcoin, and this whole industry. But I just think that Donnie is a great guy. There's so many reasons to listen to this episode. So first of all, this is another interview along with Stephanie and Hector, and you'll find those interviews in the show notes. But another interview about this emerging space, or maybe not even as emerging space, of blockchain, Bitcoin, Ethereum, cryptocurrency, these things that a lot of you have asked about to have someone on the show. So there's definitely that aspect. I think that he is at a 1,000-person company in this space, the largest pure blockchain company in the world, and so there is so much to learn from this interview about the finance space and about the blockchain space. But there's also this other facet that I think is relevant to you, even if you're not interested in that space. If you've ruled that out, if you've closed that door in terms of a potential career, there's so much that I think you can learn from Donnie's interview. And the first one that jumps out to me is alignment. And I love his candor in this interview in talking about how this is his third job out of business school. And it was a struggle. There were dark moments along the way to finding a job that really aligned with his values and his interests and his motivations and the things that he found interesting in life. And he talks about taking a 30% pay cut for a 300% increase in happiness. And so there's a lot of things that stood out for me. If you want to stick around after the interview, I'll do a quick debrief of the kind of the top 5 things that stood out to me. But I want to get right into this interview and not waste any more time. As always, at beyondtheuniform.io, you'll find the show notes. You'll find links to all the resources we discuss. You'll find a text transcript of this interview, thanks to Kathleen Dillon. Thank you, Kathleen, for doing that. And you'll also find our new coaching component where you can get subsidized coaching to figure out what you want to do, whether that is your 4th job out of the military or your first one. We have coaches who want to work with you and help you in that process. So check that out. With that, let's dive in to my interview with Donnie Benjamin. Joining me today in Brooklyn, New York is Donnie Benjamin. Donnie, welcome to Beyond the Uniform.
Thanks for having me.
So for listeners, I wanted to give them a glimpse of your background. Donnie works at ConsenSys in the office of the founder. ConsenSys is a blockchain venture production studio. Their global team is building an ecosystem of consumer-centric products and enterprise solutions using blockchain technologies, primarily based on Ethereum. And for those of you trying to get familiar with LinkedIn, the ConsenSys is classified in the software industry. They were founded in 2014, and they have almost 1,000 employees on LinkedIn. Donnie started out at West Point. He served as an Army intelligence officer for 5 years, attended Harvard Business School, and has worked at Google, Qualtrics, and Future Finance. And so, Donnie, to start things off, how would you describe ConsenSys and what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so ConsenSys is probably the largest pure blockchain company in the world now. IBM's obviously a lot bigger, but they do many things besides blockchain. So we are just blockchain. Our founder, Joe Lubin, was also a co-founder of Ethereum. So he started the company to really build out the ecosystem for Ethereum and for, I'm sure many people who are still trying to wrap their head around this whole blockchain thing and cryptocurrency thing. Ethereum is trying to be a world computer. So, the Bitcoin blockchain protocol, all it really can do is transact Bitcoin. It's a digital ledger, and it's an immutable ledger that keeps track of all the Bitcoin transactions ever. But that's really all this revolution it can do with this revolutionary technology. So Ethereum is basically using the blockchain technology and creating a new internet, what we call Web3. And ConsenSys has four main prongs. One is creating the developer and product tools for Ethereum, what we call dApps, or decentralized applications, that we hope will replace normal applications people use today. Biggest difference is in a dApp, you're in control of your data and identity. We have a big consulting arm that we do consulting work for government and enterprises. We have a big academy arm that trains developers how to build on Ethereum, as well as trains business leaders on how to use Ethereum technology in their businesses. And we also have a capital arm. Right now, we have a $50 million venture fund, and as well trying to build up, and also a token, what we call Token Foundry, which is how do you help companies do token raises, but in the right way, so regulatory legal framework that's acceptable by regulators throughout the world, and making sure that projects that actually add value, as opposed to just a lot of scams that have cropped up.
That's crazy. So first of all, it's crazy that your founder was one of the founders of Ethereum. It's if listeners aren't familiar with blockchain and cryptocurrency, like for instance, for me, I dabble in investing, and my largest stake right now is in Ethereum. It's a major part of the cryptocurrency or the blockchain space. But what I love, or what I'm understanding from what you're saying, is that, I mean, you guys are betting big on the future of Ethereum, and you are building up these resources to educate people, to help engineers build in this ecosystem. There's almost like an investing and consulting arm. It's like every facet of what this industry is needing, you're trying to be the go-to resource. Is that somewhat accurate?
Completely. Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. And something else that makes ConsenSys pretty unique and amazing is that we're kind of this principle of a blockchain where it's decentralized. We're remote first and decentralized. So we have people in over 30 countries. And we don't have managers. We're a completely flat organization. So all the normal corporate things we don't really believe in or do, which is interesting. And Joe likes to say that everything is an experiment in ConsenSys, because what we're trying to do at scale don't really think has been done before. But I absolutely thrive. And I know a lot of people at the ConsenSys are like, oh, I thought from the military you'd be so top-down command and control, but you seem to love this decentralized piece, and have to kind of explain the military. It's not exactly as they see it in the movies, but it's pretty awesome. And anytime you want to do an entire podcast on cryptocurrencies and blockchain, happy to do that.
That's something I will probably take you up on, because I want to delve more into your career path, but I get so excited talking with you about this, because every time I speak with someone like you or my friends from business school who are in this space, it feels like what I imagine people felt at the advent of the internet, where it's like, this opens so many possibilities. And just like my understanding of that time at the advent of the internet, the people like you who are in this space, my perception is there's almost like this cult-like reverence and the like the way that you describe the flat organization and like literally trying to change the way business is done. And that's exciting for me, because on this frontier of a completely new industry is where the norms of business can fundamentally shift. And I'm just, I'm completely an outsider, a very, very distant outsider. But I'm wondering, is that your kind of experience as well? Does it feel like you are on a frontier and that you're creating new things, not just in technology, but in the way that business is done?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a great way. It's listeners, I wonder if we talked about this before. We didn't, but that's exactly right. We actually think there's going to be a fundamental shift, not just in how the internet is run, but how we interact with each other and how businesses interact with members of society. A huge shift. And a lot of it to me is common sense. Like, I've worked in companies where you're going to get force ranked at the end of the quarter or year or whatever against somebody. And it almost in the back of your head is like, how can I totally be invested in all of us winning if I know at the end of the year, one of us is going to get ranked higher and one of us is going to get a bigger bonus? It's so ludicrous to me. It's kind of this like one team mentality. And when you get rid of that, when you work in these autonomous self-managed teams where you're all so invested in each other's success, it's a complete game changer. And I'm convinced that way of working, I'm convinced the remote first way of working, the work at when you want to work best. So we, realize some people are morning people, some people are night people, some people don't want to commute. And when you get people to work when they're best at working, again, you get an increase in productivity, happiness, well-being. So I think between more companies working like ConsenSys in the future, plus this amazing technology of an internet powered by Ethereum, it's going to have ripple effects across everything we do, all our interactions with people. So we're pretty excited about it. It's slow going. Some people think we're crazy, but I definitely get the feeling that and we say it's like we're at 1994 right now, the internet.
Wow. And your title is basically the member, or you're the office of the founder. I'm assuming that means that you're working with I believe it was Joe, the founder, and you're probably, I almost view you as like an admiral's aide of just whatever needs to get done. You're one of the people who can work on projects and put out whatever fires and kind of focus on things. But that's completely an assumption. I'd love to learn about kind of what you do and what your title means.
Sure. I think in a lot of companies it might be called like Office of the CEO or be more proper, but because Joe wants ConsenSys to be so flat, he knows that if he calls himself the Chief Executive Officer, that implies hierarchy. That implies that he has some formal authority over people. So he refuses to be called the Chief Executive Officer, which is pretty amazing and authentic to have that sort of leadership. He's the founder of the company. That's what it is. And you can imagine with the growth of Ethereum, with the growth of the ConsenSys, with all the projects we're doing throughout the world, building an office or a circle of people to help you manage all that is definitely a force multiplier. So it feels a little bit like an aide's role. There's a few of us on the circle because we kind of take different lanes just because there's so much going on, and we're kind of all we're not carrying backpacks. We're not an entourage, but definitely helping people understand what's going on as the company grows, helping Joe figure out his time and travel. I think it's that, or it could also be called the chief of staff. There's just many of us, but I actually think it's probably one of the best jobs someone could get at coming out of the military, especially when they want to learn about business. I would say my first 6 weeks, all I did was follow Joe around, meeting to meeting, and he said, "Just learn. Don't worry about like having to feel like you have to do something to fill your time." So 6 weeks of that, way better than my MBA, 2-year MBA, and I got paid to do it instead of having to pay a lot of money. So I think the exposure you get, what you can learn, is just incredible in this type of role.
What is that? So I'm aware that your team is different and that everyone has different schedules and kind of there's a lot of autonomy. And I also know that listeners really enjoy the granular details of kind of what representative day might look like for you. And so could you just take us through a day? It could be a made up day, it could be yesterday, but just to give listeners a sense, and if you're able to kind of timestamp it to give them a sense of like, okay, what time do you start? What sort of activities are going on throughout the day? What time do you end? I know that helps them get a sense of the lifestyle component of your current job.
Sure. I'd say it's tech in New York. So day probably doesn't start earlier than 9:30. And a lot of it's dependent on Joe's schedule. So if he's in town and he has meetings, then one of us will be on it to capture notes, capture follow-ups, to connect people with various people. So we'll start by attending some of those meetings. I mean, every day is so wildly different because we're just growing so fast, and there's no real, besides a few company-wide meetings we have normally occurring, there's not much of that. I do a lot of first looks at candidates who've reached out to Joe, who he thinks might be a good fit for the company, screen them, gauge their interest and understanding of Ethereum, and then try to help find them the next best person to talk to. Talk to people interested in working with us from a business development perspective, trying to gauge are the people legit? Do they know what they're talking about? You can imagine there's just so much nonsense in the space right now, which is also unfortunate. A lot of people just trying to do get rich quick stuff. Luckily, we're very moral, ethical, legally aligned at ConsenSys, trying to do everything right. So making sure people don't fall into those buckets. We have lunch from one time to another, which I also think is something, especially tech companies get away from, that you can only be away from your desk at a certain time. Sometimes it can go for a full lunch. Sometimes there's lunch meetings. Sometimes just grab something from the convenience store and eat it at your desk. And sometimes Joe's speaking or has events in New York. We'll go attend those. Also, I like to do that for a few reasons. One, stay up to date on what's going on in the ecosystem, and two, be able to talk smart and thoughtfully about Ethereum in the space. And I get that a lot by hearing Joe talk.
Mm. What's your sense for so when I think of the role that you're doing, it's like one part is New York, one part is finance, and one part is, I don't know if you'd consider it early stage, but it's at least a startup. And so all three of those together individually I associate with a large volume of work hours per week. And then all three of them together, I'm like, man, what's the truth of your life right now? Is this like 100-hour weeks? Is it more intense, less intense, or what's that overall lifestyle component?
That's a good question. I've never felt burned out. I think that's because I truly am passionate about this space. I truly love the people I work with. And even if it takes me, I do a lot of explaining about Ethereum and blockchain, and I thought a year in I'd get so sick of it because normally people have a lot of questions, but I just still love it, and I love educating people about it. So there's probably some 100-hour weeks going on in there, and I probably do more work on the weekends than I think I do, but it's not going into the office. It's queuing things up, prioritizing things in an inbox, or whether it's people I have to return messages to on Slack or people I have to follow up with. And I never feel, I guess, overtly like I'm working. It just feels like part of a mission I'm trying to keep going. But there's a lot of stuff going on. It's definitely not just in and out over a certain period of time. but I think it is possible to have. I think Bezos calls it work-life harmony because he doesn't think work-life balance is a real thing. So how do you mix the two? And I think the work-life harmony is just really nice, where they overlap in a way that I enjoy because I'm such a believer and so passionate about Ethereum that it doesn't. I know it sounds a little cheesy, but it doesn't feel like I'm working necessarily. But I'm sure there are absolutely days and weeks where the day was long. I mean, I've had days where I've gotten back late and just had to breathe a little bit. But it's more so because there's so much information, right? Kind of like you pointed out, there's so many different things going on in the company that sometimes my brain's just so full, and I just can't have anything else come in that day because I'm trying to think about all the random things from across different parts of the organizations that have come in like one day's period. I think I just need to just take a breather, go to sleep, and let my brain reset.
That's great. I love the sense that I get from that of autonomy, and it's not the sense of you're just working to cross things off to-do lists. It's like it's taking this long lens of prioritization and doing some of the heavier lifting, like giving your brain space to process and take in all of this information and establish a new view of the company and the industry and the space. Like, it seems like a very thoughtful role rather than just trying to get things done for the sake of being busy.
Exactly. And I do want to point out, and I think this is an important point to people listening, this isn't my first job. This is my third job after business school. And it's not like I just found a job that motivates me like this. This is the first one, and I had to try things out. I had to be okay moving away from things and jobs that were just okay, or I could have been fine, could have been comfortable, but I didn't wake up excited to do it. So I really want people to know this was a struggle for me to find something like this, and I even got a little concerned after a while. Well, maybe I just don't love working anywhere. Maybe it's just something that I'm just not built to do. And I think fortunately this opportunity came up, and maybe it was a little more, I guess I might have a high risk tolerance, but it was definitely riskier, especially a year ago. So I think you need to take some risks and try new things to find it if you're willing, if it's something you really want to have this level of passion and excitement. But it's not, I don't want it to come off like, oh, I just found this job and I love it and I love everything. That's not it at all. I mean, it definitely took some trial and error.
I really appreciate your saying that, and that kind of matches my worldview, which is the only way to really figure out what you want to do is through thoughtful experimentation. And I had on the show, for listeners who listened to my interview with Andy Chan a couple weeks ago, he was the one at business school at Stanford who had said, don't worry about figuring out what you want to do. Start figuring out what you don't want to do. Start shutting doors and start, doing internships and trying different things and figuring out what characteristics you like. Do you like that company size? Do you like that industry? Do you like the people you work with? And being, giving yourself permission to try and move on, which I think for some veterans might be difficult. There's this thought of commitment, or this thought of staying somewhere for a while. And I also admire here, Donnie, that you were willing to not compromise. It sounds like one of the things that you wanted from your career is you wanted to do something that you felt passionate and energized about, and that's true for you. It may not be true for everyone listening, but what I abstract from that is that you put a premium on that quality, and then that was something you weren't willing to compromise on. And it sounds like maybe in previous roles you had a portion of that, but you challenged yourself to find something that was more or deeper in that. And I think that that's difficult to do, because I could imagine myself just thinking, especially on that first or second job, like, well, maybe this is what it is. Maybe I have too high of expectations for this. But it sounds like you were persistent in pursuing that, and that allowed you to find something that really does connect with you in a deeper way than those other jobs did.
Yeah, exactly. Like, are my expectations too high for work? The other thing I'd say is I think one of the flaws that you can get into going into business school that I've realized lately is, like, in the military, we all know what each other make based on time and rank. There's no bonuses. So and when you go to, an academy, nobody is getting recruited by corporate America or anybody. So everyone's just focused on getting into the Army, and there's no real, I don't remember having talk about pay, like, ever at West Point. When I got out and I realized, wow, business school is all about dropping numbers and how much money people make and average salaries. And I think I wasn't prepared for that sort of shift in mindset of that way of thinking about a job. And I think it slowly crept up on me more than I realized, where my expectations and happiness of a job were correlated to how much money I was going to make, when we all realized, at least I felt like I was fairly compensated in the military. Or when I say fairly, maybe what I mean is, like, I had enough money to live in the military. I took trips. I didn't need egregious amounts of money to be happy. And I think one of the traps that's easy to fall into, coming from 9 years of your adult life where you never talk about pay, into a place where that pays a lot, talked about a lot, is that it can really set a negative impression in your mind that you need tons of money to be happy, or money's the ultimate driver of happiness. And I think, what I joke is, for this role, I took a 30% pay cut from my previous role, but I'm 300% happier. So to me, the trade-off's clear, right? It's if I realize that there's more to happiness and enjoyment than just a check, it's clear. But I think a lot of people, and probably myself right after business school, weren't going to be willing to make that trade-off, or understand that loving what you do is worth a lot of money, even though it's not, economically the same thing. So I think that's also something to be cognizant of.
That's such a great distinction, and that whole thing around pay is incredible. And I again admire that you were willing to compromise salary in exchange for happiness. And it sounds absurd, but I think there's so many people that are unwilling to do that. And so that is really incredible. And I wanted to ask about how you got into this industry. And so, if I'm understanding things correctly, you were at business school. You worked for about a year at Qualtrics in I believe Salt Lake City, and then you moved on to Ireland with Future Finance, and then ended up here. And so I'd love a little bit of clarity around that path getting there, but more importantly, how did you first get involved in blockchain, and how did you eventually end up at ConsenSys?
Yeah, I mean, the Qualtrics one was really based on, I wanted sales type experience. That was kind of the one thing I realized. Not only do you not have it in the Army, but they really don't teach it at business school. And surprisingly, it's such a huge, once you get into sales and you start to see the sales world, you realize it's a huge economic driver in the world, especially the United States. I mean, sales is most of marketing. Salespeople are everywhere, but they really, I don't know how it was the GSP, but they really just don't teach it. And I thought that was a pretty important skill to have and understand. It was there, though, when I saw who was kind of the de facto chief of staff to the CEO. I kind of realized that's kind of the role. I was an XO in the Army, enjoyed that piece. I saw it translated into the civilian world. It's kind of like, I want that sort of job. I just really, it was like, that guy knows everything that's going on in his company, kind of being a right-hand man, an Alexander Hamilton to someone's George Washington. So really wanted to pursue that in a startup, and got that opportunity at this company in Ireland. But when you're in, I think, a fintech startup right now, you realize, or I don't know how you wouldn't realize this, that the legacy institutions, there's no way you're going to disrupt them. There's no way I know there's all these, quote unquote challenger banks out there, the digital only. They're not going to beat JP Morgan Chase. They're not going to overthrow them. They might have some young users. Maybe they'll get bought by JP Morgan Chase. Maybe that's their goal. But like the fundamentals of the banking world are never going to change. And it was kind of a little disheartening to see that. And it was really trying to understand if there will ever be this sort of disruption. I had heard about Bitcoin through the news over the years. Honestly, my first thought was, this is stupid. I don't, it's so silly. Why would anybody buy any Bitcoin? But then I discovered Ethereum, and I now have a huge amount of appreciation for Bitcoin, by the way, which we can also talk about on a separate crypto-only podcast. But really saw Ethereum as, this is the game changer. This is the thing that can totally rewrite how society operates, but in a good way, where we recreate a more fair and balanced society. I think I've always been troubled by the fact that people can profit off of war without anybody having themselves or any of their family or anyone they know ever be in the military. I think that's crazy. Taleb just came out with that new book called Skin in the Game, which everyone's talking about. And I'm always picturing, like, how can you, support, or I guess, how can you profit off of war without having any skin in the game of that war being won? And I guess I'm kind of going on a separate tangent, but in a way, blockchain removes the need for a lot of intermediaries, and it provides transparency over who's doing what. And it's an immutable ledger of everything that's ever happened. And it changes this paradigm of, especially in a tokenized world, that if you hold tokens in something, that you can have skin in the game for a project or whatever it is that's successful, as opposed to just being able to get rich off of other people doing your fighting for you. I might have gone on a crazy tangent.
No, I love that. No, I think that's very helpful. I think it's helpful for me and hopefully for listeners too, to kind of hear the values driving this decision. And I think that also gives context of why a veteran may be attracted to this industry. And so what was the process of getting that job and applying to that job then, your current role?
Yeah. So I cold applied. Every other job I've had, I've got connected to people. They reached out to me. This one was a pure cold email application. I actually thought I was probably not technically competent enough to work in the space because it was still burgeoning. So I think it was I don't like to use the word luck, but it was right time, right place sort of mentality. I was willing to take a risk on something that wasn't as big as it is now. Thoroughly did my research, and I think because it was still new, when people at the company saw my resume, they were willing to have a chat with me. And when I was able to show a true understanding and passion for the technology, not like a deep technological understanding, right, but like an understanding of applications to business use, fundamental changes in how we work together as a global society, it helps. And now I don't think that process would necessarily work, just because of the growth. But timing's everything. I still can't believe I don't even think I put a cover letter. I just cold emailed my resume.
That's incredible. I want to ask a question, but I want to give a disclaimer to listeners first, which is, on the podcast, I try to highlight paths to different careers. There's always exceptions. That the intention of all of this is to just give you different data points, but I think that veterans are very great at breaking through walls and finding their own ways. So know that if this space interests you, there are 1,000 ways to get into it, and this story is just one. So all of that said, Donnie, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is just from your experience, how essential is an MBA to this career path? And more specifically, I'm asking this line of questions of, I'm thinking of someone who's on active duty right now. We're chatting. It's June 15th, 2018. So let's just say someone's listening to this episode around then, and they're getting out soon, and maybe they want to go into this space. And what I'm trying to tease out is, is it possible or advisable for them to go directly into this industry? Is that possible? And what elements of your background were helpful for this role that it might be worth them pursuing prior to diving in?
Wow, that's a
that was a big one.
A tough one.
I could have broken that down a little bit better, but yeah.
Well, I will say something I left out is it did help me that I wasn't a chief of staff position, and this role at ConsenSys externally was called chief of staff. So that did help, right? It's not a role you see a lot, especially at a startup and especially at a tech startup. So the fact that I was coming from this role at a tech startup and applying for the same role, or what was called the same role at another one, I think was helpful as well, and fortunate. But okay, so the MBA. Okay, so the way I reasoned spending all that money was when, like I said, when you're at an academy, there's no corporate recruiting. I didn't even know when I told someone I got an HBS, they said, a lot of people from McKinsey go there. And my honest answer was, who's McKinsey? I'm 27 or whatever, and they're like, it's not a person, it's a management consulting firm. And I said, awesome. What is a management consulting firm? And they looked at me strange, and then they explained it, the lifestyle, what you do. And I said, not only do I still not understand what a management consulting firm is, it sounds like the worst job I've ever heard of, just with all the travel and everything. But then I get to school, and 2/3 of the people want to go into management consulting. So I only tell that story because that's how I felt like I needed. And by the way, my parents weren't in the business world, so I didn't grow up with it, and I didn't get it in undergrad or in the Army. So it was, to me, it was okay. I'm just going to learn about everything that's going on. I do think we're moving to a world though where if you can get good at things by teaching yourself, whether it's on a YouTube video or a Udemy course or something like that, where if you go to business school to learn financial modeling, that's silly. You're not going to learn financial modeling the way you need to in an MBA program. You're going to meet the people who might help you be able to get a job doing that. So it's such a tough question, because I honestly believe that if you're really good at something and if you have a real passion for it, you're going to figure out a way to make it work. Like my buddy from the Army, from West Point, he was debating whether to get an MBA. He got a job at Facebook after getting out of the Army, and he's just been doing great. He's been flying up the corporate ladder, and he's like, oh, I didn't need an MBA. I just show them I'm good at my job. I work hard. And now he makes more than, every MBA, most MBAs in tech I know. So in that sense, I don't think you do. And probably if he wanted to move around Facebook and try different roles, he would have that opportunity. So I think it depends what you want to get out of it. If it's purely if it's to network and understand how the business world works, hopefully not everyone is blissfully ignorant of it as I was. But it's tough. It's a tough question.
No, that's a great and balanced answer. And one of the other things I wanted to ask about is resources. You talked about staying up to speed on what's going on in the industry, and so I'm thinking of someone who's maybe deployed or on a ship or on a stationed overseas, someone who's you've piqued their curiosity and they want to learn more about this space. Are there a few resources you could recommend in terms of whatever your thing is, blogs, books, podcasts, YouTube channels, just something that they could go check out today?
There's an Ethereum wiki website that I think we call it going down the rabbit hole. That is a great place to start because it links out to a lot of great stuff, and you can go on that landing page and just spend a weekend going to the different lakes, exploring the different things. So that's what I'd recommend. And I think it's got stuff for business people and developers alike. So no matter what side of your interest is, you can really start to go. I'd stay away from social media to learn about this stuff because there's a lot of disinformation. And if you're new to it, it might be hard to separate, the signal and the noise. So Ethereum Wiki, highly recommend. Yeah, that's a great place to start.
Awesome. And I know we're towards the end of our time here. I sincerely hope to have you back on the show to just kind of talk about the industry, because I just really appreciate the way your brain works and the way that you think about this. But I always like to end with a more open-ended question, which is, you've answered a lot of my questions, and we've covered ground about your role in this space and how you got there. I'm sure there's things I didn't ask about that you'd love to share with a community of veterans and active duty members of the armed forces. So just wanted to turn over to you if there's anything we haven't covered that you want to make sure people hear.
Yeah, something I wasn't expecting was that we might have taken for granted just being in an insular sort of military environment is that most of the world doesn't understand the military or how we work or the value we add. And I think we get told a lot while we're in all the value we add could add to civilian life. But when you actually get out there and you are working with hiring managers and recruiters who have never met anybody in the military, and all they have is this strange Hollywood stereotype in their head about one-sided, very authoritarian people, it was more of a struggle or a confusion than I expected. And I think there are a lot of companies. I think it's not as much of an issue if you want to go to a huge corporation that have a robust veterans program. But I told one venture capitalist, like, I didn't want a veterans job. Like, this is, we have our whatever group, it's 80% veterans. Like, not that I don't want it. I don't necessarily want that job. I mean, I want the opportunities afforded to everybody, where they're coming from. I have, an engineering degree. I want the same opportunities you give to anybody with that degree, not just whether they were a veteran or not. So I think, don't overestimate people's understandings of what you did or what value you can bring. You're going to have to, especially in a smaller firm, be forthcoming about it and educate people. And hopefully when you go to an organization that's growing, then you can create a veterans group and help educate everybody there about what it's actually like to be a veteran and the value you bring, and help it grow and change people's minds that way, and just be, an excellent representative of the veteran community. But don't be afraid. I'd even say, think about how you can proactively let people know what you actually did, the skills you actually gained, and that, a lot of times I think we're just as entrepreneurial, if not more so than anyone else, especially given what we've been doing. So don't be afraid to let people know that.
That's great advice. I love that. I love that self-advocacy. I love that. It's interesting because you had talked about sales, and I completely agree with you that that's not really taught at business school. And yet it is one of the most, especially for entrepreneurship, in my experience, one of the most foundational skills. And so there's this value of sales. And then in the 180 plus interviews like this I've done, that almost every veteran has talked about that they struggle with selling themselves, that they struggle talking about their own accomplishments. They can talk about their team or their unit's accomplishments, but the social norm in the military is not speaking candidly about your own accomplishments or underplaying them. At least that was my experience. And so what I love about what you're saying is, realizing how little people understand about the military, and that it's each person's responsibility to advocate for themselves and be able to explain what they did and be able to talk to their strengths and skill sets and what they can add, and do that educating for the people they're working with.
Absolutely. And I don't know why I got it in my head, at least, that everyone seemed to understand what veterans did. But when you realize that most people have never met a veteran, maybe outside of their grandparents in the war or whatever, or a modern day, I guess, veteran, that there is a divide and there is a confusion, especially when the only thing they're going off of is a movie. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, Donnie, thank you so much for your time. I hope to have you on again very soon, and really appreciate your sharing your story with the Beyond the Uniform audience. Surface. Thank you so much for listening. Quick debrief on the things that stood out to me. First of all, I love that concept of work-life harmony from Jeff Bezos. I think that is a great thing. A lot of you ask about work-life balance. There's a lot of fear and concern. I share that as well, but I love that framework around work-life harmony and realizing it may not always be 50-50, but it may be something where maybe you're spending more time on personal life than work or vice versa, but it's done in a way where both sides win, where you have more passion and energy and more aliveness. And honestly, if I'm an employer, I would rather have someone who's 200% more alive for an hour a day than someone who's just dead and going through the motions for 8 hours a day. So I think there's something there to unpack. I loved his this thought of just kind of the struggle of finding a job that really met his prioritization. And whatever your priorities are, and if you don't know those priorities, coaching, or more specifically, quick plug for the Beyond the Uniform coaching program, coaching is a great way to identify and uncover and get crystal clear on what those priorities are. But for him, one of those priorities seems to have been passion and aliveness. And so I love that he prioritized that. He did not compromise. He did these short one-year stints at companies until he found something that met that, and I love that. I appreciate the tenacity of the cold email application. Does not work a lot. Almost everyone I interview got their job through an introduction or referral, things like that. But that was a cool part of his story. I really enjoyed his thought around shifting his mindset around pay. That matches my experience. The military was very transparent in pay. It was very easy to understand that. And then when I went to business school at Stanford, it was mind-blowing that I had classmates that were making $500,000 a year in salary prior to business school. And it really did shift in a way that's lasted for a long time, my view of money and prioritization for it. And I just love that Donnie was quicker than I was to catch on to that distinction and was willing to make a trade-off of taking less pay for something that makes him more satisfied. I thought he was spot on in his thoughts of sales, that's not taught in the military, it's not taught at business school, and yet it's a huge economic driver in the U.S. And so I +1 his recommendation to get sales experience. That resonates with me. And then I love at the end that thought that people don't really understand your role in the military. So taking the time to explain that to them, or more importantly, demonstrate to them what you can do and advocate for yourself, not underplay that. And if there was a way I could help the veteran community shift our mindset collectively around that, where you are doing a service to future veterans, if you're able to advocate for yourself and show and explain what you bring to the table and not underplay it, you're going to make it easier for future veterans as well. Thank you for listening. If you are enjoying the show and you want to support, quick top 4 ways you could help. Easiest way, leave a review on iTunes. I know that sounds weird, but that kind of is something that sponsors look at. It's something that also increases our ranking and distribution on iTunes, which is a major way people get a hold of the show. Second, tell your friends, tell people on whatever way you think will help them get to know the show. But I'd love to continue to get veterans listening to the show. Third one is sponsors. If you know someone who would like to sponsor, trying to get that going to subsidize the cost of producing the show. And then lastly, there is a donate button at the top right at beyondtheuniform.io. Thank you for listening this far. Have a great week, and I'll be back next week with more stories of military veterans about their civilian career. Take care.